Welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlottesville, Virginia. You can find all of our program offerings and information about our Sangha at www.imeditation.org. We meet weekly on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, currently on the Zoom platform, for meditation and a Dharma talk given by one of our teachers. We also meet daily at noon Eastern Time on Zoom for sitting practice. We hope you can join us.
I was working on a different talk, and someone sent me an email on Sunday with a question and asked if I would offer a Dharma talk about that in response to that. And I said yes, and so we have a different Dharma talk tonight in response to their question. And I say that partly, I'll tell you the question in a minute, but also just to remind you that yes, you can do that. Any one of us is happy to entertain your thoughts, your questions, your suggestions. And if we don't know, if I don't know, I'll pass it off to somebody else in our community, or maybe even a guest teacher who might speak to that more effectively. So I was just really happy to receive the question and to receive the request. So I wanted to respond to it right away. So here we are tonight. The question was about relationship. And specifically, a person whose speech and behavior had been quite abusive. Now, I'll suggest that you don't assume that the questioner was a woman. I have worked as a psychologist, as a therapist with many men who have been caught ever so painfully in abusive relationships. It can be really challenging for men to be caught in that kind of a spiral. So, nevertheless, someone asked a question. They were trying to invite presence and letting go and non-reactivity and loving kindness and compassion. How to do that. And with their permission, I can quote a little bit from the question. Here's how it goes. The hardest part of it all is that the other person is a meditator who constantly reads spiritual books of all sorts of sages and talks about how they are almost attaining enlightenment. Just a little note, you'll get this as I go through the talk. That comment is a red flag in itself. People with advanced spiritual practices are notorious for their refusal to discuss at all their personal attainments. But then the questioner to me went on, how is it possible for one to be enlightened and be cruel to others? Someone else I know who experienced sexual abuse, again, don't assume that that person who experienced sexual abuse was a woman, said that the abuser was also a meditator who followed a spiritual path. How can someone meditate and do horrible things to other people? And so lastly, they said they struggled with where does loving kindness and compassion end and codependence start? Where does letting go and denial begin? How does all that work? So a question about a couple things. One is, as part of it was specific, what is sort of a general question is like, what is enlightenment and how does that relate to people's human behavior and human characteristics. And then what does our practice have to say about all this? How do I navigate this? How do I navigate this question or this relationship? So 3 separate questions I kind of teased out. One is, how is it possible for one to be fully enlightened and be cruel to others? How can someone meditate and do horrible things to other people? And how do you tell the difference between, say, loving kindness and codependency? And as I thought about it, I realized that I actually, oh, God help us, I actually am going to give 3 talks in response to this question, because there are quite a number of angles that we can look at this, or lenses, if you will, that we can look at this through. So tonight I want to give a talk that really has more to do with the context, maybe that first question, how is it possible for one to be fully enlightened and still be cruel? And in a way, that's the easiest question. There's a simple answer, sort of. I'll give you the simple version of the answer. The simple version of the answer is it's not really possible for someone to be a Buddha, a fully awakened one, and be cruel to others. Those are incompatible. A little more complicated response comes from Philip Kapleau Roshi, where the questioner asked him, he said, but doesn't enlightenment clear away imperfections and personality flaws? Roshi says, no. Enlightenment does not clear away imperfections and personality flaws. It shows them up. It reveals them. Before awakening, one can easily ignore or rationalize shortcomings. But after enlightenment, this is no longer possible. One's failings are painfully evident. Yet at the same time, a strong determination develops to rid oneself of them. Even opening the mind's eye fully does not at one fell swoop purify the emotions. Continuous training after enlightenment is required to purify the emotions so that our behavior accords with our understanding. This vital point, he says, must be understood. So what I take from that is that the Buddha, a fully enlightened being, probably has done that work. I mean, the stories about the Buddha going through many lifetimes where he's purifying his own behavior and emotions and responses in the world. So a fully enlightened being is fully purified. But it's possible for people to attain enlightenment states and to not have fully purified all kinds of personality flaws and imperfections, and to need to work on them. And indeed, enlightenment reveals them rather than rids oneself of them. So someone who would be enlightened or have, if you will, enlightenment, access to enlightened states, would be someone who would know those flaws and be willing to acknowledge them and reveal them. I'm going to pause there for just a second. Anybody want to make a comment about that or ask a question? I just want to, you don't need to, but just want to check in here for a moment. Okay, don't see any little hands raised, I don't think. See happy faces, don't see any little hands raised. So a bit of context for us as Buddhists. Buddhism, like every single spiritual tradition, has publicly reported incidents of even very advanced teachers, spiritual teachers, who behaved badly. I'll give you a couple of examples. Um, these are public, this is public knowledge. So you can, it's public knowledge. So there's nothing I'm telling you tonight that isn't widely known. Trungpa Rinpoche, widely recognized both by Tibetan Buddhists and by other spiritual practitioners and scholars as a preeminent teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, was a major figure in the dissemination of Buddhism in the West. He translated numerous Tibetan Buddhist texts, introduced Vajrayana teachings to the West. He was a major teacher, maybe the major initial teacher of Pema Chodron, and indeed of my teacher, John Welwood. Some of his teaching methods and actions, however, particularly his heavy drinking, his womanizing, and the physical assault of a student and his wife, caused a bit of controversy during his lifetime and afterwards. So a very wise, very well-respected teacher whose heavy drinking, womanizing, and physical assault of a student raised a few questions. This was one that really distressed me. Sogyal Rinpoche, the Tibetan Dzogchen Lama of the Nyingma tradition, who was recognized as the incarnation of a great Tibetan master and visionary saint of the 19th century. He was the founder and former spiritual director of Rigpa, an international network of over 100 Buddhist centers and groups in 23 countries around the world. And here's the part that got me. And he was the author of the best-selling book, which I love, The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, which has been printed in 30 languages and 56 countries. And to this day, I personally find his teachings incredibly moving and valuable. And one of his teachings has formed for years an important part of my daily practice. Sogyal Rinpoche was accused of sexual and physical assault and abuse, as well as misusing charitable funds, with allegations stretching back to the 1970s. Rigpa announced these allegations would be investigated by an outside party, and a report has now been published upholding most of the allegations, even though Sogyal Rinpoche denied them. So part of the question, the hardest part of all, the question to me, the hardest part of all was that the other person is a meditator who constantly reads spiritual books of all sorts of sages and talks about how he is almost attaining enlightenment. Well, first of all, people don't talk about how much they've attained enlightenment. And secondly, there's a problem here. It can't be true. In our own tradition, more recently, and some of you may know of this one because you've perhaps been connected in some way, Noah Levine is the son of an American Buddhist author, Stephen Levine. His teenage years were filled with drugs, with violence, with multiple suicide attempts, and detention at juvenile halls. And he actively, as a young person, rejected the teachings of his father. But in 1988, after 3 felonies and 1 suicide attempt while jailed, he hit, he says, an emotional rock bottom and realized his addiction. And in a desperate attempt, this is from Wikipedia, he says, in a desperate attempt to relieve his fear and uncertainty, he tried to apply the meditation techniques his father taught him and saw for the first time that they worked. And then shortly afterward, he became highly involved in a scene of punk hardcore punks, and he attended a 12-step program, and he began a meditation practice. He was then trained by Jack Kornfield of Spirit Rock Meditation Center. Later, he earned a master's degree in counseling psychology, and he founded, this is where some of you may know him, he founded Refuge Recovery, different from, there's another group that we have been talking about working with. It's different from that group. Noah founded Refuge Recovery, a Dharma-based addictions recovery community. And in March 2018, Against the Stream released a statement that they were investigating allegations of sexual misconduct on his part. Noah Levine denied then and continues to deny the accusations. However, in August of 2018, Against the Stream released a statement announcing that after their investigation, they had concluded that the preponderance of evidence indicated that Levine had likely violated the third precept of the Against the Stream Teachers Code of Ethics, which requires teachers to avoid creating harm through sexuality, and that he had violated that not with one, but with multiple women. And in 2019, Spirit Rock's EAR Council, actually our EAR Council was based on their EAR Council, which is the Ethics and Reconciliation Council, released a statement that the organization and Dr. Kornfield rescinded his authorization to teach, recommended that he cease all Buddhist or meditation teaching and dedicate his energy to the rehabilitation of his own heart. I am not aware that he has done that. That may or may not be true, but so we can wonder, how can this be? How does this work? How can this be? How can people who are very wise, very experienced, very advanced spiritually, very well regarded, and very well intentioned stumble so badly? Okay, I want to talk about that. There are several ways we can look at this. The first that I'll talk to tonight is there are really multiple kinds of intelligence. I'll try to unpack that a little bit, which is a modern distinction. There also are multiple kinds of wisdom, which is a Buddhist teaching. And third, there are millions of ways of getting confused. I was thinking as I was preparing this about, I was raised Catholic, and the quote from Matthew that Jesus was quoted as saying, "By their fruits you will know them." He says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Therefore, by their fruits you will know them." So we have to look really deeply. We have to look at the fruits. Okay, I want to pause again. Any comments, questions, curiosities?
Sharon, there's one question in the chat box. A little
I see.
person who asked it, I think, has left, but it might be of interest.
Okay. Thank you, Judy. So if you are enlightened, you are alert enough to see a cruel thought. Well, the Buddha the question is, you're enlightened enough to see a cruel thought in time to control it. Not necessarily. You are enlightened enough to, the Buddhist teaching, before you do an action, you look to see, is this going to cause affliction for myself or others? While you are doing an action, you look to see, is this going to cause affliction for myself and others? After you do an action, you look to see if this is causing affliction for myself and others. I would propose that if you're enlightened, you are alert enough to see cruelty at one of those places, and to work to repair both internally and externally whatever damage has been done. Now, I'm assuming in all of this that the Buddha was fully enlightened and therefore did not have cruel thoughts. But most of us are somewhere, almost by definition, by virtue of being human, it means we have stuff to work on. So even very wise and advanced teachers can still have stuff. I'll talk to that in just a minute about how we make sense of that. Okay. I think I maybe saw, did I see another question? No? But to know that the cultivation is not, we like to think of enlightenment as sort of a thing that happens. And that enlightenment is, I've read in some places that enlightenment process never ends, you know, that you continue to kind of get more and more deeply aware of goodness. And indeed, the power and control issue comes from a sense of a self who needs to have some kind of identity as a being who is this. Yes, of course. And indeed, aren't we human beings who are cultivating respect for ourselves and other human beings? And we mess up. Go figure. You know, we just do. So a quality of enlightenment doesn't mean that it's an enlightened being, but a quality of enlightenment is to notice when you mess up. And then to make that a part of the practice so that we're working to address not so much the behavior as the greed, hatred, and delusion that are driving that behavior. By practice can become a man. Yeah, Jeff wants, would you speak to spiritual bypassing and how practice can become a manifestation of narcissism? I'm gonna spiritually bypass that question just a little bit, Jeff, but come back to it if I'm not addressing it, because I think there's some teachings, and maybe Judy, if you would put in the chat box, I gave you a whole bunch of references, so I want to give you some things that you can look at yourselves that maybe you can look at later, and that might be helpful. And this is sort of in a kind of a little bit of a sideways way, Jeff, addressing your question about spiritual bypassing. And because tonight I want to talk about different levels of human development and multiple kinds of human intelligence. And I'm going to read a fair amount of this because much of this, all of this in this part comes from the book of Integral Meditation by Ken Wilbur. Now, those of you who are familiar with Ken Wilbur will flinch when I tell you to read a book by Ken Wilbur, because historically, his books have been just awfully dense and hard to read, and you fall asleep because you can't understand what he's talking about. Integral meditation is not like that. It's readable. You can understand it. So if you're interested in this part at all, take a look at that book. And so he says that ongoing research has demonstrated that human beings have at least two very different types of growth and development. And this means two very different types of spiritual engagements as well. The two types, one is a path of waking up to different states of consciousness. Much of what we teach when we teach meditation, talks to that kind of waking up, different states of consciousness where we can see below, if you will. Last time I talked about the turbulent surface, the ways that the mind just kind of keeps us on this turbulent surface, and that our practice invites us to kind of drop into deeper awarenesses, deeper states of consciousness below the turbulent surface. So the spiritual practices tend to speak to this waking up kind of development. There also, Ken says, is a path of growing up through different levels. So he makes a distinction between states of consciousness and levels of human development. And he notes that that the path of waking up, the path of spiritual practice, is thousands of years old. Even before the Buddha, people were exploring waking up. But the path of growing up through different levels, stages, if you will, of human development is only about 100 or 100 and maybe 50 years old. And this is important because there has never been a path of growth or development that actually has included both of these incredibly, these intersecting, but actually separate kinds of growth. We've literally been focusing on either just one or just the other type of growth. So in a way, Jeff, that question, and I know you know this, that question is that we can use one type of growth to avoid the other. For example, there can be people who are very wise, and there are all kinds of people in the world who are very wise, but who are not spiritual practitioners. They don't have a spiritual practice. And it's like, well, how can they be so wise and mature when they don't have a spiritual practice? Well, it's a different kind of thing. I'll explain that more in a minute. And then there are people like Trungpa Rinpoche and Sogyal Rinpoche who have very advanced spiritual practices, who developmentally haven't fully grown up into a mature human personality. And that kind of advanced spiritual practice can actually allow people to bypass the important stages of just ordinary human development. Again, if you want to know more about this, read Ken's book, but I will read some of it to you. He says, we have literally been focusing on either just one or just the other type of growth. And that means we have been producing individuals who might be quite highly developed in any of their ordinary multiple intelligences, but they are not awakened or not enlightened. They have not had a realization of what some traditions call the supreme identity, where individuals experience themselves as being literally one with all of reality, one with the entire universe. Essentially, what one is awakening from is the ceaseless, chaotic, incoherent thoughts and ways of framing reality that govern most human activity, generating endless states of suffering. What one is awakening to is a pure, transparent, open, empty, clear awareness, free of incoherent and broken thoughts and frameworks. Again, most spiritual traditions, and indeed most of what we teach at IMCC, is about different ways to deepen our capacities to wake up. On the other hand, Ken writes, humanity did produce individuals, people who have followed a path of waking up, but they could still be relatively immature in many of their human capacities. They might be poorly developed psychosexually and thus take sexual advantage of their students. It's been said that sometimes Asian teachers who have grown up since they were little teeny boys in monastic life, when they come to the West, don't know how to navigate power and sexuality. Or they might not be well developed morally despite their spiritual interests. And many Nazis, it's well known, for example, were well versed in yoga and meditation. Or they might be homophobic or sexist or racist or xenophobic or authoritarian or rigidly hierarchical and so on. They may have been one with the world, but their capacities in that world remain relatively immature or even dysfunctional and pathological. So just to touch on this a little bit, we all know that human beings at birth, even before birth, we start with this little egg, this little egg, this little wiggly sperm, we just start with this little organisms, and we have to develop from that to people who can figure out how to navigate your computer and get your dinner done, and just all the things that you have to do as a grown-up. So we have to go through these different stages of, if you will, psychological development. And each of those stages has a kind of what Ken calls a grammar, a way of viewing the world that becomes sort of the reality at that stage. And so we can kind of know, for example, well, take the he says there are 8 different categories of human development. Take one of them, let's say moral development. We know, for example, that moral development goes through all kinds of, that goes through stages, and that a 2-year-old, in terms of moral development, will be very different from the Dalai Lama, right? We just kind of know that. You give the Dalai Lama some blocks to play with, you give a 2-year-old some blocks to play with, it'll be a whole different thing. That children have to kind of grow through these different stages, incorporating, kind of becoming coherent at this stage, and then moving on as with some guidance to the next stage, where they kind of get disorganized again. And we know how that works, where we move from one place to another, and then we get sort of disorganized initially. And then we have to kind of learn and grow and develop and get help. And we kind of, we kind of organize that. Those of you who have just retired, you've moved into a different stage, and it's going to require a bit of reorganization. How do I navigate with, in the world now with this whole different kind of, set of ways of being? And it's just an ordinary human developmental stage that has a certain grammar, certain things that matter. People can get stuck at a stage in a couple of ways. One is because of maybe inadequate teaching, or possibly because of trauma. There can be pockets within a particular stage, let's say emotional development, where there might be certain aspects of emotion that get kind of cut off. I don't learn how to deal with anger, or I didn't learn how to deal with self-esteem, or I didn't learn how to deal with grief, or even joy. I didn't know how. So what I'll do is I'll sort of just kind of shut that off aside, and then kind of try to move to the next stage, but I haven't got quite all of myself going there. So it can kind of end up being a little bit warped as an adult, where if I heard a spiritual teacher, for example, one time, at a retreat, somebody's mother had just died. And the spiritual teacher found her crying in the woods and chastised her for not realizing impermanence. I would propose that was evidence that there was a bit of a pocket there where that teacher was not able to relate well to just ordinary human grief and sadness. There was a bit of a blind spot. The other thing that can happen at a stage is that people just become caught there and don't and just don't develop. We think about somebody, for example, who is maybe stuck at a stage of narcissism. All 2-year-olds are very narcissistic, are just like me. I am the only person who matters, and it doesn't really, nothing else matters but me and how important I am and how everybody loves me. That's just how 2-year-olds are. But we can get stuck there if there's trauma, if there's no help in moving beyond that stage, such that we can see grown-ups who continue to be addicted, if you will, to a very young stage of development and haven't really grown up, haven't really matured. And this can happen in all kinds of different ways. Ken, in his book, he works us through different categories of development and different stages of development, and how you can identify different stages of human development, so that people can have very advanced spiritual practices, but be caught in very immature human development, And most of the teaching kind of treats those as kind of parallel paths, and we don't really look together. We look at them together until we see these sort of, until we have these sorts of questions, and we see these, and we have these sorts of puzzles. How can this be? Well, it's because they're different things, um, and so we need to be discerning. The Buddha himself, there's a teaching, and I gave you the link to the Sutta, the Kalama, I think that's how you say it, Sutta, where he was teaching in Kalama, and they said, Lord, there are some priests, the people came to you, he says, there are some priests and contemplatives who come and they expound and glorify their own doctrines, but as for the doctrines of others, they deprecate them, revile them, show contempt for them. He says, and then other priests come and they do the same thing. And, everybody's sort of saying, listen to me, but don't listen to them. He says that they leave us absolutely uncertain and in doubt. Which of these are speaking the truth and which are lying? And the Buddha says, of course you are uncertain. Of course you are in doubt. When there are reasons for doubt, uncertainty is born. And this sutta could actually be a whole teaching in and of itself, because what he says here is, he says, don't go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability, or even by the thought, this contemplative is our teacher. When you know for yourselves that these qualities are unskillful, these qualities are blameworthy, these qualities are criticized by the wise, these qualities, when adopted and carried out, lead to harm and to suffering, then you should abandon them. And in typical Buddha's way of teaching, he then goes on to say, when you know for yourself that these qualities are skillful and wise. Now, there is also, so there's the reference to the sutta, but there's also a reference there to a couple of commentaries. And in the first reference, there's a commentary by Thanissaro, who gives a bit of a caution about that. It isn't, because the Buddha isn't saying just do what you think. It's not quite what he's saying. He's saying something more rigorous, Thanissaro says, than that. Not because of reports of others or one's preferences. Instead, he says, any view or belief must be tested by the results it yields when put into practice. And to guard against the possibility of any bias or limitations in one's understanding of those results, they must further be checked against the experience of people who are wise. And then he gives references in his commentary for what some of those for what some of those ways of checking one's experience. But basically, the Buddha says, don't just assume that because a spiritual says something, or a spiritual teacher says something that sounds kind of cool, that therefore it's true, or because they claim a certain thing, that it's therefore true. What you do is you look for results. And I want to quickly tell you a story which some of you will recognize because you've been there. You were there, rather. Some of you know I teach Insight Dialogue, and one of the practices of teaching Insight Dialogue, before I go on further, and Bhikkhu Bodhi also has a commentary on that sutta, which is also very useful to take a look at if you're interested in that. One of the ways of teaching Insight Dialogue is we don't plan ahead. We just sort of listen to what's going on, and then we decide what contemplation to offer next. And my co-teacher and I got together. We decided what to teach next. And so my partner and I decided which contemplation to offer, and then we trotted off to have this evening session. And when the time came to offer the contemplation, we each looked at each other and went, okay, because we each had assumed that it was perfectly obvious that the other one was the better one to offer that contemplation. And so my co-teacher, being very brave, said, okay, I'll try. And so she did it, and it was like awful. Made no sense. It was completely muddled and garbled and made no sense. So she came back to me. So everybody's out there, trying valiantly to contemplate. She came back to me, and we both agreed, yeah, that really kind of sucked. So I said, okay, tell you what, I will do it. And so I went out, and mine sucked even more. Mine was even worse. It was worser. And then I came back, and we went, yeah, that was even worse. And then she went, okay, let me try again. And so then she tried again, and that one sucked even worse than that. I mean, and we came back, and so everybody's out there diligently trying to meditate with the contemplations that we're offering. And the two of us got in hysterics because the harder we tried, the worse it got. But that's not the point. I mean, of course, I mess up. So anyway, so we ended the evening, and then the two of us were still in hysterics afterwards. We're in our room, and we're just peeing in our pants. We're laughing so hard because no matter what we did, we just couldn't fix it. And so the next morning, we went in and we told everybody. We said, oh, by the way, last night, here's what happened, and we really messed up. And here's why we messed up. Here's what happened. And we just messed up. And what was really lovely and interesting was that some people noticed that they had assumed that the problem was their own spiritual practice was inadequate, that they had not entertained the possibility that even a junior meditation teacher like Sharon Beckman-Brindley could really have just completely blown it. So it was a nice teaching, although not quite the teaching we intended, that, really, when you feel confused, when something doesn't feel right, when something doesn't smell right, sound like right, look right, work out right in your practice, that is something to work with and inquire into, not to just assume that somebody else is right and you're wrong. So I wish I had more time for questions. We can stay afterwards if you like, but I want to read a little poem, and then I'll stay afterwards if you have questions. But I want to let people go who are ready to go. Let me get to the poem, because David White has this wonderful poem that's also in your chat box. And the poem is Sweet Darkness. When your eyes are tired, the world is tired also. When your vision has gone, no part of the world can find you. Time to go into the dark where the night has eyes to recognize its own. There you can be sure you are not beyond love. The dark will be your home tonight. The night will give you a horizon further than you can see. You must learn one thing. The world was made to be free in. You must learn one thing. The world was made to be free in. Give up all the other worlds except the one to which you belong. Give up all other worlds except the one to which you belong. Sometimes it takes darkness and the sweet confinement of your aloneness to learn anything or anyone that does not bring you alive is too small for you. Anything or anyone that does not bring you alive is too small for you. So there we have part one. We'll end there for tonight. Feel free to send me questions if you like. And I will take a couple here that I didn't address fully and fold them into one of the future talks. So blessings.